The story begins in a cozy suburb of a small American town, where life seemed almost ideal. Gregory Thompson, a successful lawyer, was the epitome of the modern family man. With his wife, Amanda, and their young son, they seemed to have it all: a beautiful home, prestigious jobs, and most importantly, a strong relationship based on mutual trust. Amanda, who worked as a teacher at a local school, was known for her kindness and love for her child. She was the person who was considered the heart of their family, someone who approached every aspect of life with care and attention. When a nanny, Marilyn, a young and energetic girl who had recently graduated from college, came into their lives, it looked as if the family had taken another step towards even greater prosperity. Marilyn was recommended through an agency, and her qualifications and reviews were impeccable. She immediately hit it off with Gregory and Amanda's little son, which allowed the couple to feel confident knowing that their child was in good hands. At first glance, Marilyn seemed like the perfect addition to their family life. However, over time, something has changed. Amanda began to notice small but alarming changes in her husband's behavior. At first, it was little things: phone calls that he answered behind a closed door, or sudden delays at work that had never happened before. He became more distant, often lost in his own thoughts and avoiding the closeness they had previously shared. These signs gradually gave Amanda a feeling of anxiety and uncertainty, which intensified every day. At a certain point, when this feeling became unbearable, Amanda decides to talk to her friend to discuss her concerns. A friend assures her that all this could simply be a consequence of Gregory's stress at work, and that everything will work out in their lives. But her friend's words do not bring relief. Amanda feels that something has changed dramatically in her life, and this change is negative. Suspicion and anxiety do not leave Amanda. One day, when she decides to stay home, calling in sick, she hopes to spend the day in peace, away from these thoughts. But when Marilyn arrives at work, Amanda suddenly notices that her presence in the house causes a strange feeling of tension. It would seem that nothing has changed. Marilyn is still caring for their son, still smiling and friendly. But something subtle in her behavior or in the way she communicates with Gregory arouses new waves of suspicion in Amanda. Finally, these suspicions culminate when Amanda finds one unexpected message on Gregory's phone. A message that makes her heart skip a beat, and her world begins to crumble. In that moment, she realizes that her worst fears have been confirmed. Gregory is cheating on her. This discovery turns her life upside down, leaving her feeling betrayed and empty. At this point, Amanda doesn't know how to proceed. Her world, which seemed so strong and reliable, suddenly shattered into thousands of fragments. And all she could do was hold on to these fragments, hoping that she would be able to put them back together again, not suspecting that events awaited her that would forever change her life and the lives of those she loved. After Amanda found out about her husband's betrayal, her world completely changed. She could no longer look at Gregory with the same trust and love that they had previously. His every word and action began to arouse suspicion and disgust in her. Internally, she tried to remain calm, but her soul was engulfed in a storm of emotions. Gregory didn't notice this. He continued to act as if nothing had happened, but this only increased her pain. Amanda couldn't just ignore the obvious. She began to closely monitor her husband's every move. She checked his phone, his emails, looking for any evidence that could confirm her fears. Her anxiety grew into paranoia, and she soon began to suspect that not only Gregory, but their entire lives, including relationships with friends and colleagues, were built on lies. On the days when Gregory stayed home, Amanda tried to stay close to closely monitor his behavior. She felt that her old life was slowly but surely slipping away from her hands. Her thoughts kept returning to that fateful night when she found a message on her husband's phone, a message that contained enough hints to understand that there was something more going on between Gregory and Marilyn than just a work relationship. Amanda didn't know who to share her feelings with. She was afraid that if she told anyone about her pain, it would only make the situation worse. She continued to hide her anxiety and fear, even from her loved ones. But the internal tension grew, and in the end, it resulted in a physical reaction. One evening, when Gregory was late at work, Amanda felt those familiar waves of panic again. Her heart was pounding, her breathing became ragged, and at some point she felt like she just couldn't stand it anymore. The panic attack took her by surprise, She could barely breathe, her hands were shaking, and cold sweat broke out on her forehead. This was the moment when her mental and physical state reached boiling point. Desperate and afraid, Amanda called her brother Jason. He was always her support and protector, the person she could turn to in the most difficult moments. Hearing her ragged breathing and tears, Jason instantly knew something terrible had happened. He came to her as quickly as possible, without asking unnecessary questions. When Jason entered the house, he saw his sister sitting on the floor, her eyes full of tears and despair. Her face was pale and her voice was barely audible. She told him everything, every detail, every little thing that accumulated in her heart and tore it apart. Jason was shocked. He couldn't believe that the man he considered a brother could do such a vile thing to his sister. For Jason, it became a personal matter. He always felt a strong connection to Amanda, and her pain was his pain. He perceived her betrayal as his own. The moment she told him about Gregory's affair with Marilyn, rage awoke in him. This rage was so strong that he could not control it. He couldn't just sit back and watch his sister suffer. His thoughts began to swirl around one idea: revenge. Jason was a determined man, and when he made a decision, he followed through with it. Anger and a sense of justice filled his mind, leaving no room for doubt. He was sure that Gregory must pay for his betrayal. Jason began planning his revenge. He knew he had to act carefully so as not to draw attention to himself. He carefully thought through every step, every possible scenario. It wasn't just an emotional decision. It was the cold, calculating decision of a man who believed that justice must be done, even if it meant breaking the law. Meanwhile, Gregory suspected nothing. He continued his relationship with Marilyn, thinking that his secret was well hidden. He didn't know that his world was about to collapse. His complacency and confidence in his impunity only strengthened Jason's determination. And then the day came when Jason decided that the moment had come. He knew that Gregory would be late at work again that evening, and Marilyn would leave early. This was the perfect moment to carry out the plan. Jason took with him a knife that he had carefully chosen in advance. He was determined to finish what he started. When Gregory returned home, he was surprised to see Jason in the house. But before he could say anything, Jason pounced on him. The anger he had been holding inside finally burst out. He did not hear Gregory's screams, did not see his attempts to resist. All he felt was the sense of justice that filled him with every blow of the knife. Gregory died quickly, but Jason did not stop until he was sure that his mission was completed. The blood that stained his hands was a symbol of revenge for his sister. He felt that he had done the right thing, that he had restored justice. But he also understood that there would be a price to pay. Amanda, who was in her room at the time, heard noise and screams, but could not bring herself to go out and see what was happening. She knew that her brother would not stop, and deep down, she knew that this was the only way to end their torment. The blood on Jason's hands was quickly cooling, but in his mind the rage and adrenaline still continued to rage. He stood over Gregory's body, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The silence that fell in the house seemed deafening. All he could hear was heavy breathing and the thumping of his heart. But the most terrible realization came with cold, inescapable clarity. He had just killed a man. This murder was not just an act of revenge. It was the destruction of an entire world. Gregory, once a beloved and respected member of the family, now lay lifeless on the floor as Jason, his killer, looked on with cold determination. But soon determination began to give way to horror. He realized he had to act quickly to cover his tracks and ensure his sister's safety. The first thing he did was close the door to the house so that no one could enter and see what had happened. He then hastily began to look for a way to dispose of the body. Thoughts raced through his head: where to hide it, how to hide all traces. Jason understood that time was working against him, and every delay could cost him his freedom. In the end, he decided that the simplest plan was the best. He had to dispose of the body as far from the house as possible, where no one could link it to the crime. Jason found a large black plastic garbage bag in the garage. He slowly and carefully wrapped Gregory's body in the bag, being careful not to leave any marks on the floor or furniture. It was a task that disgusted him, but he knew he had to do it for Amanda's sake. Everything he did for her. Once the body was packed, Jason returned to the house and carefully wiped down all the surfaces he touched. He knew that even the smallest mistake could cost him his freedom, and therefore he acted methodically, like a true professional. Every drop of blood, every little thing was destroyed. He carefully walked through all the rooms to make sure he didn't miss anything. The next step was to dispose of the body. Jason took him out in his car under cover of darkness. He chose an abandoned area on the outskirts of the city, where few people visit. This seemed to him an ideal place to hide the body and leave it to decompose away from human eyes. He knew that the further he went, the less likely it was that he would be found. On the way, he looked back at the streets several times, checking if he was being followed. Every oncoming car made him panic, and he felt his heart ready to burst out of his chest. But, to his relief, the road was deserted. When he finally reached the chosen location, he stopped on the side of the road, pulled Gregory's body out of the trunk, and lowered it down the slope into a remote ravine. He then hurriedly returned to the car, hoping that everything had gone unnoticed. On the way back, Jason felt worse and worse. He realized that he had just taken the life of a man, but he also understood that he could not have done otherwise. He killed for his sister, to spare her the suffering that Gregory caused her. He hoped that this action would help Amanda start a new life, free from pain and betrayal. Returning home, Jason tried to calm Amanda down, but she was in shock. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of what had happened, and she couldn't believe that her brother had actually committed murder. Jason's words about how he fixed everything did not bring her relief, but only increased her feelings of guilt and fear for the future. Meanwhile, Jason understood that their quiet life would now forever remain in the past. He tried to figure out how they could explain Gregory's disappearance. He knew the police would be interested in this sooner or later, and they needed to have a credible story. But despite all his efforts, he did not have a clear plan in his head. The next morning began with alarming silence. Amanda woke up with the feeling that what happened that night was just a bad dream, a nightmare that would dissipate with the first rays of the sun. But reality quickly returned to her as she glanced at the empty side of the bed where Gregory usually slept. She knew that he would never return there again. Her mind was filled with fear and guilt, and she couldn't imagine how to live with this terrible secret. Meanwhile, Jason, who had spent the whole night thinking, was also filled with worry. He understood that his actions would inevitably lead to an investigation. The police would start asking questions, and he and Amanda needed to be prepared for anything. They discussed possible scenarios, trying to come up with a plausible explanation for Gregory's disappearance. The decision came to them quickly. They would declare that Gregory simply left home. Perhaps he decided to run away due to stress at work or family problems. This was their only hope for salvation. The plan seemed reliable enough to them, but neither Jason nor Amanda took into account one important point. Gregory was a man with many connections and responsibilities. When he didn't show up for work at his usual time, his co-workers became worried. Gregory was known for his punctuality and responsibility, and his sudden disappearance raised suspicions. Colleagues tried to contact him, but his phone did not answer, which only increased their anxiety. They did not hesitate and contacted the police. When local detectives received a report that Gregory was missing, they immediately began an investigation. The disappearance of such a respected person could not go unnoticed. First of all, they went to the Thompson house to talk to his wife and see if anything unusual had happened. Amanda, waiting for the police to visit, tried to control herself. She knew that any wrong word or movement could arouse suspicion, and she had to play the role of an alarmed but unsuspecting wife. When the detectives arrived at her home, she greeted them with all signs of anxiety and fear. Jason was also there, supporting his sister and trying not to draw too much attention to himself. Detectives entering the house immediately sensed a tense atmosphere. They were professionals and were used to all sorts of family drama, but something seemed wrong here. Amanda looked too calm, and Jason seemed to have no emotion at all. But despite this, the detectives began asking standard questions. When Gregory left, did he have any enemies? Did they notice anything strange in recent days? Amanda was telling them a story she had learned by heart. She said that Gregory had become withdrawn and distant in recent weeks, that they had had some disagreements, and that perhaps he had simply decided to take a break and go away to think things over. She mentioned his stress at work and suggested that he might go away for a few days to clear his head. The detectives listened to her with attention, but did not express any emotion. They knew that in such matters they had to be extremely careful and not make hasty conclusions. However, they were alarmed by one detail. Why didn't Amanda try to contact her husband? Why didn't she raise the alarm when he didn't come home? Jason was also asked questions, but he tried to say as little as possible. He claimed that he did not know about Gregory's plans to leave, but supported his sister's version of his possible stress. The detectives made a few notes and decided that first they needed to check all possible routes and places where Gregory could go. The next day, police began a thorough search of the area. They checked all the surveillance cameras located on the roads leading to the Thompson house. They looked for traces of Gregory's car, but none of the cameras recorded his car that night. This was the first alarming signal for detectives. If Gregory really left voluntarily, then why didn't any of the cameras record his departure? They also decided to interview the nanny, Marilyn, who was one of the last people to see Gregory before his disappearance. Marilyn, unaware of what had happened, said that in recent days Gregory seemed a little tense to her, but she chalked it up to family or work problems. She also mentioned that she didn't notice anything suspicious the night Gregory disappeared. Meanwhile, detectives began looking for other possible leads. They checked Gregory's bank accounts, his recent calls and messages. They wanted to know if there were any signs he was planning to run away or meet someone before his disappearance. But all this time they returned to the same question. Why didn't his wife raise the alarm earlier? Gradually, suspicions began to accumulate. Detectives began to closely monitor Amanda and Jason. They decided that their stories were too similar, and this made them wary. They began to look for the slightest contradictions in their stories, and soon stumbled upon something interesting. When interviewed again, Jason mentioned that on the night of his disappearance, Gregory was with his sister and was helping her around the house. But Amanda, who previously said she was home alone, made no mention of her brother's visit. This contradiction was an important signal to detectives that something was wrong with the story. They decided it was time to increase the pressure and begin a more active investigation. The detectives, who received new instructions, began interrogations with greater persistence. They began looking for evidence that could confirm or refute Amanda and Jason's versions. Meanwhile, Jason and Amanda began to realize that their plan was beginning to fall apart. And now only time will tell whether they will be able to get out of this nightmare with impunity. Detectives leading the investigation felt that Gregory Thompson's case was becoming increasingly complicated and complicated. At first glance, it may have seemed like a simple case of sudden disappearance, but every day new details accumulated that made them doubt the original versions of events. Detectives first focused on Amanda. They knew that her behavior seemed strange from the very beginning. She did not try to find her husband, did not call the police immediately after his disappearance, and generally behaved too calmly for a woman whose life had just been subjected to such a shock. Her story seemed thoughtful and logical, but at the same time too smooth, as if she had prepared her story in advance. They started by bringing Amanda in for questioning again. This time, they decided to take a tougher approach to see how she would react to the pressure. The detectives asked her questions again and again, each time testing her reactions on small details, trying to catch her in a lie. Amanda answered the questions with apparent confidence, but inside she was seething. Her fear of exposure grew every day, and it began to affect her behavior. When the detectives realized that Amanda would not give herself away so easily, they turned their attention to Jason. He was an important figure in the case, and his presence in the house on the night of Gregory's disappearance aroused increasing suspicion. In addition, his alibi, proposed the first time, seemed to them not reliable enough. Detectives decided it was necessary to question him in more detail to understand his role in this story. Jason was called to the police station for a more serious conversation. Unlike Amanda, he tried to say as little as possible and avoid unnecessary details. He knew that any little thing could give him away, so his strategy was to say only what was necessary. The detectives began with general questions about his relationship with Gregory, what he was doing on the day of the disappearance, and how he learned that Gregory was missing. Jason answered confidently, but the detectives felt that there was something more hidden behind his calmness. At some point during the interrogation, detectives decided to use separation tactics. They took Jason out of the room and left him alone for a few minutes, until he started to get nervous. At this time, they discussed among themselves all the contradictions that they had noticed in his story. When they returned, they abruptly began asking questions regarding the night of Gregory's disappearance, clarifying every step Jason had taken and every little detail he might have mentioned earlier. Under the pressure, Jason started to get a little nervous. He knew the detectives didn't believe his alibi, and that made him feel uncomfortable. He knew that if he continued to follow the same line of behavior, it could cause even more suspicion. But he also knew that if he changed his story, it might be perceived as an attempt to hide something important. This dilemma caused him to experience an internal conflict, which gradually began to manifest itself in his responses. Meanwhile, detectives decided to test Jason's story in practice. They carefully studied the footage of surveillance cameras located in the area and soon discovered an interesting detail. On the night of Gregory's disappearance, the camera recorded a car similar to Jason's car leaving the area at a late hour. This discovery immediately caused a new wave of suspicion. If Jason really had been at Amanda's house all night, then why was his car leaving the area? They decided to invite Jason back for questioning and present him with this information. Jason was taken by surprise. He didn't expect detectives to find evidence that would so clearly point to his lies. Realizing that there was no point in further denying the obvious, he decided to change tactics and admit that he had indeed left the area that night, but only to get some air and think. This confession only increased the detective's suspicions. Why did Jason lie about his whereabouts? What was he trying to hide? The detectives decided not to press him too hard at this point, but they knew he would now need to be kept under close surveillance. They began to consider him as one of the main suspects. In parallel with the interviews, detectives continued to explore possible motives. They understood that behind such a crime there must be strong emotions: jealousy, anger, fear. They carefully checked Gregory's financial status and his business contacts to rule out the possibility that his disappearance was connected to something other than a personal relationship. But all paths led to the same thing: a personal drama in a family that got out of control. Meanwhile, Amanda began to feel more and more vulnerable. Her meetings with detectives became increasingly tense, and she realized that she could not hide the truth for long. She was afraid that Jason, under pressure, might break down and tell everything that had happened. This thought drove her to despair, and she began to think about how to somehow get out of this situation before it was too late. The detectives, sensing that the case was approaching a climax, increased the pressure on both. They began to play on the differences in their stories, trying to sow seeds of doubt and get one of them to betray the other. The questions became more and more persistent, and the detectives did everything they could to make Jason and Amanda start to make mistakes in their answers. The detectives keeping an eye on Jason and Amanda knew their patience was beginning to pay off. With each new interrogation, with each small discovery, their suspicions grew stronger. They knew that Jason was hiding something, and it seemed that their intuition was correct. But they lacked the main thing: direct evidence that could link Jason to Gregory's disappearance. They decided to act according to the classic scheme: divide the suspects and try to force one of them to betray the other. The tactic is time-tested and often effective. Detectives understood that Jason and Amanda had a strong connection, but even the strongest bonds could break under the pressure of fear and guilt. The first thing they decided to do was bring Amanda in for another interrogation, but this time take a tougher approach. They started with questions regarding her brother. Detectives hinted that they had good reason to believe Jason was hiding something. They tried to convince her that he could be involved in Gregory's disappearance, and that her help in this matter could significantly influence the course of the investigation. Amanda, feeling the pressure, began to hesitate. She loved her brother and knew that he did this for her sake, but the fear of justice and the possibility of losing everything made her think. The detectives continued to press, gradually extracting more and more information from her. They used good cop, bad cop tactics, alternating threats with promises to help her and her son if she agreed to cooperate. Amanda couldn't stand it. She began to get confused in her answers, and her nervousness became obvious. Detectives noticed this and increased pressure. In the end, under this unbearable oppression, Amanda broke down. She couldn't keep it to herself any longer and admitted that Jason was indeed involved in her husband's disappearance. She said that he killed Gregory in a fit of anger when he learned of the affair, and that they both decided to cover up the crime to save her life and reputation. This confession became a key point in the investigation. Now the detectives had a serious witness and a reason to arrest Jason. They immediately went after him. Jason was arrested at his home without resistance. He understood that the moment of truth had come. During interrogation, Jason initially tried to remain calm and denied all charges. He claimed that his sister was probably just trying to protect herself, and that he had nothing to do with Gregory's disappearance. But the detectives were ready for this and decided to use Amanda's confession to force him into a more frank conversation. When Jason was shown the recording of his sister's confession, his face paled. He realized that now all his defenses had collapsed. His escape strategy no longer worked, and he was left with no choice but to tell his version of events. Jason had to confess to the murder. He described how rage and a sense of injustice gripped him when he learned of Gregory's betrayal. That night, when he came to his sister and saw her in such a terrible state after a panic attack, he realized that he could not leave it unpunished. Anger clouded his mind, and he decided that he must restore justice himself to protect his sister. He told how it all happened, how he waylaid Gregory when he returned home, and how their quarrel escalated into a brutal fight. A flash of anger, blows with a knife. All this was done automatically, as if someone else was directing his actions. He understood that he had crossed the point of no return, and the only thing left was to try to hide the traces of the crime. He told how he removed the body and hid it, hoping that no one would ever find Gregory. The detectives listened to his confession with grim satisfaction. Now they had all the evidence they needed to close the case and charge Jason with murder. But they also understood that this crime had destroyed not only Gregory's life, but also Amanda's, who now had to face the consequences of her actions. Jason was charged with premeditated murder, hiding a body and obstruction of justice. Amanda, although she helped him hide the crime, was recognized as an accomplice and also stood trial, but her guilt was mitigated by her cooperation with the police. The trial attracted the attention of the entire community. People who knew Gregory were shocked to learn the truth about his death. They could not believe that a man whom they considered honest and respectable was involved in such a terrible crime. But what shocked them even more was how a family drama that seemed just a private matter turned into a tragedy that left deep marks in the lives of many people. After Jason's confession and subsequent arrests, the investigation came to its logical conclusion. But, as often happens in such cases, the truth, finally revealed, did not bring relief to anyone. Instead, she left behind only a feeling of emptiness and destruction. Jason's trial became the main event in the city. The public followed every step of the case, discussing what happened on the news and in the streets. People who once knew this family as exemplary now discussed it with sympathy and distrust. How could such a terrible tragedy happen in a seemingly perfect family? At the trial, Jason admitted his guilt. He looked exhausted and devastated, realizing that his life was ruined. In his speech, he described how he was filled with anger and despair when he learned of Gregory's betrayal. He claimed that he acted impulsively, without fully understanding the consequences of his actions. However, this confession did not reduce the sentence. The court, taking into account all the circumstances of the case, issued a strict verdict. Jason was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to a long prison term. Amanda, despite cooperating with the police and admitting her role in covering up the crime, was also found guilty of being an accessory. Her sentence was less severe than her brother's, but still severe enough for her to realize that her life would never be the same again. She would spend several years in prison and then live with a stigma for the rest of her life. The trial of Jason and Amanda was a painful lesson for everyone who followed the case. The public discussed not only the fact of the crime itself, but also how destructive emotions can lead to irreparable consequences. This story reminded everyone of how fragile human relationships are and how easily they can be destroyed under the influence of passion and jealousy. After the verdicts were passed, life in the city gradually returned to normal, but the shadow of the tragedy hovered over it for a long time. The house where the Thompson family once lived was now empty and evoked gloomy associations among local residents. No one wanted to remember what happened, but it was impossible to forget. Amanda and Jason's family were also deeply shocked by the incident. Parents, friends, and acquaintances tried to understand how they could have missed the signs that something was going wrong. They all felt guilty and regretful that they could not prevent this tragedy. They were left alone, each alone with their thoughts and memories. Amanda's little son, left without both parents, was placed in the care of relatives. He would grow up not knowing his mother, and perhaps someday learn the truth about what happened to his family. This was one of the most difficult aspects of this story, the realization that the consequences of the crime would be felt for many years to come, affecting those who had nothing to do with it. The detectives who completed this complex investigation knew that they had done their job, but the aftermath of the case remained. Success in solving the crime did not bring them joy, because in front of them stood a destroyed family that once seemed so happy. This case reminded them that behind every story like this, there are real people whose lives will be changed forever.